Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really strapping in. We're going deep into military strategy. And who better to guide us than one of the giants, right? Carl von Clausewitz and his masterpiece on war.
Yeah, get ready. Clausewitz, he can be a little bit of a roller coaster. He's brilliant, but he's challenging. But honestly, super insightful. I mean, even centuries later, we're still grappling with his ideas.
And that's especially true for you out there listening in. We know you live the realities of military life, so we're going beyond the textbook, No hypotheticals. We're diving deep into chapters 1 and 2 of Book 3, and that's where Clausewitz really lays out what makes for a strong military strategy. And we want to make sure that it, really clicks with what you face on today's battlefields.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes Clausewitz so interesting, he's not just some guy writing from a cushy office. He went through the Napoleonic Wars, right? Chaos, uncertainty, just the whole mess of conflict. So, his ideas are grounded in that reality.
So, no ivory tower here. Let's dive into his definition of strategy. Right out of the gate, he says, and I'm quoting, "Strategy is the employment of the battle to gain the end of the war." Sounds simple enough at first glance.
Right, almost deceptively simple. But there's a lot packed into that sentence. See, he's saying that every battle, every maneuver, every single decision you make in a war, they all have to be connected to the bigger picture. You're not just trying to win battles to rack up a score, right? You're winning the battles that get you closer to winning the entire war, the political objective.
So it's about having that strategic vision from the get-go, making sure that every move takes you closer to the ultimate goal.
Exactly. Think of it like, well, a skilled surgeon. They're not just treating the symptom on the surface. They're thinking about how each cut, each procedure plays into the overall goal of, making the patient healthy again. That's Clausewitz's point. On the battlefield, everything you do needs to fit into a larger strategic framework.
And this framework, this strategy, it's not just about what happens on the battlefield, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. And this is where you really see Clausewitz's genius. He got that war isn't some isolated thing. Politics, resources, what the public thinks, all of that plays a role in how a conflict unfolds. And that's what makes strategy so complex, so multifaceted.
So you can't just be good at tactics. You have to be good at logistics, diplomacy, even public relations, all at the same time.
Exactly. You've got to be thinking on multiple levels. And all of that complexity, it leads us to another key point that Clausewitz makes, the illusion of simplicity in warfare.
Okay, now that's an interesting one. What does he mean by that?
So he's saying that the core building blocks of strategy, they're actually pretty basic. Things like flanking maneuvers, concentrating your forces, taking advantage of an opening. Any decent military leader is going to know about those. So where's the real genius? He says it's in the execution.
So you can draw up a beautiful plan on a map, but actually getting your troops where they need to be when they need to be there under pressure, that's a whole different game.
Exactly. And Clausewitz uses Frederick the Great's campaigns as an example, particularly around 1760. Frederick the Great wasn't really known for coming up with brand new tactics. He was amazing at using those classic military moves, but doing them with absolute precision, even under immense pressure.
So it's not about reinventing the wheel, but being the best at using the wheel you've got.
Exactly. Clausewitz highlights how Frederick, even facing a stronger enemy, and often with fewer resources, he just kept adapting. He knew when to take risks, when to be more cautious, how to read his opponents.
It's like a high-stakes chess match, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like that. And that kind of takes us to another level of Clausewitz, something super relevant, I think, to, anyone who's been in a real fight. And that's the moral dimension of war.
Okay, now it's getting interesting. He's not just talking about troops and battle plans here.
Nope. Clausewitz understood war isn't some abstract game. It's about people, right? And people, well, they come with fears, doubts, courage, all of it. And Clausewitz, he calls these moral forces, and they can totally change how a war unfolds, sometimes in ways you just don't expect.
So we're talking morale, discipline, the will to keep fighting even when things are rough.
Yeah, exactly. And he says that keeping those moral forces strong, especially when you're facing setbacks or uncertainty, that can be even harder on a commander than making decisions in the middle of a firefight.
Whoa, really? Why is that?
Well, think about it. In the heat of the moment, you have to react instantly, right? Split-second decisions based on what's right in front of you. But strategy is a long game. You're dealing with unknowns, you're planning for things that might happen, trying to anticipate the enemy, and you often have very little information to go on. And this whole time, you're carrying the weight of your soldiers' lives, the outcome of the whole conflict, on your shoulders.
That's a lot of pressure. The what-ifs, the second-guessing, that could be crippling.
It absolutely is, and Clausewitz saw that firsthand. He knew those pressures could be even worse than what was happening on the front lines. He says it takes a special kind of leader to deal with all that, to stay focused, stay decisive, and never lose sight of the mission.
Didn't he use Frederick the Great again as an example?
He did. Remember those marches and those camps that Frederick was so famous for? Even experienced military leaders thought those were risky. But Clausewitz says no, they weren't reckless at all. Frederick knew the terrain, obviously he knew how to move his troops, but he also really understood his opponents. It was like psychological warfare.
So he was playing the mental game, factoring in his own troops and the enemy's psychology to make those strategic calls.
Exactly. Playing chess on multiple levels,
Yeah.
military, strategic, psychological. Which brings us to the big question. How do these ideas from like centuries ago during the Napoleonic Wars, how do they hold up now?
It's amazing, isn't it? How relevant his work still feels, even though the way we fight wars has completely changed.
Well, that's what makes him a visionary, right? It's fascinating. I mean, yeah, we have tanks, drones, cyber weapons, but those core principles that Clausewitz laid out, they're still incredibly important.
It's like you can upgrade the hardware all you want, but the software, that strategic thinking, that's what matters.
I love that analogy. So, for example, think about clearly defined objectives. Clausewitz, he hammered on this idea of knowing exactly what you're trying to accomplish with military force and how that fits into the overall political situation. And that's just as important today, maybe even more so than it was back then.
Right. You can have the most advanced weapons in the world. But if you don't have a clear strategy, a clearly defined objective, you're just setting yourself up for failure, or at best, a stalemate.
Exactly. And something else that's so important from Clausewitz is this idea of adaptability. He knew from experience that war is unpredictable. Your perfect plan, it never survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah, and we've seen that in modern wars. Things change so fast, unexpected stuff happens all the time, new tech pops up, governments fall. You got to be able to adjust on the fly.
Exactly. And it's that ability to change your strategy, to see and seize those openings, to learn from your mistakes. That's what leads to victory. Doesn't matter what era you're fighting in, what kind of weapons you're using.
So speaking of changing technology, what about cyber warfare and drones? It feels like completely new territory, new battlefields. Does Clausewitz even apply there?
That's the big question, right? I mean, do these totally new ways of fighting mean we have to throw out the old rule book? And it's interesting, even in these high-tech areas, Clausewitz still has something to say.
Okay, you really got me curious. How does a military theorist from like the 1800s have any relevance to a cyber attack?
Okay, so cyber warfare, right? You're right. It's a whole new ballgame, totally different challenges. But the core principles still apply. Remember how Clausewitz talked about understanding the enemy's center of gravity? That crucial vulnerability that if you hit it, you can cripple their ability to fight.
So like in a traditional war, that might be their supply lines or their command center or maybe a really important weapon system.
Yeah, exactly. But in cyber warfare, that center of gravity, it could be their power grid, their financial system, their communication networks. You take those out, you could win a strategic victory without even, putting boots on the ground.
That's kind of terrifying when you think about it. It's not
Yeah.
just winning a battle. It's like you could cripple an entire country.
And that's Clausewitz for you. He makes you think outside that traditional battlefield. He reminds us that the most decisive victories, they often come from exploiting weaknesses in places you wouldn't expect. It's about understanding how everything's connected, whether it's tanks and trenches or computer networks.
He's like playing chess on a whole other level.
Right. And this goes for drones, too. Drones themselves are just tools. It's the strategy behind how you use them that matters. That's where Clausewitz comes in.
So it's not about the drone itself. It's how you use it to achieve your goals, how it all fits together.
Exactly. It goes back to what we were saying about clearly defined objectives. What are you trying to achieve with that drone strike? How does it contribute to the bigger picture? And are you ready for what might happen afterward? The consequences, both good and bad.
You've got to be thinking several moves ahead.
Exactly. And that brings us back to adaptability. With cyber and drone warfare, the technology is always changing, the rules are blurry, and the enemy, they're always adapting to.
It's a whole different game. So how do we even begin to prepare for that? What's the takeaway for military leaders in these new kinds of battlefields?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, I think Clausewitz would say there's no easy answer. I mean, he wouldn't act like he had all the answers for how we fight wars in the 21st century, right? But what he does give us is a way to think about these challenges, to approach them with this understanding that, some things about conflict, they never really change.
So it's about understanding those timeless principles, the fundamentals of strategy, and then figuring out how to apply them to this new landscape of modern warfare.
Absolutely. It's about being adaptable, being willing to learn, and recognizing that when it comes to strategy, we're all still students. And that's why Clausewitz is still relevant even centuries after he wrote On War. He's a vital voice in this ongoing conversation about the nature of conflict.
He gives us the tools to ask the right questions, even when the answers are far from obvious.
Well said. He reminds us that the most important tool for a strategist, it's not a weapon or some fancy tech. It's the ability to think critically, to adapt, to always be learning.
That's a powerful lesson, not just for generals and politicians, but for anyone who wants to understand what's going on in the world today.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, that's our deep dive into the brilliant and, let's be honest, still very relevant mind of Carl von Clausewitz. We hope you found it useful, and as always, keep exploring these ideas. See how they apply to the world around you, and never stop questioning, analyzing, and strengthening your own strategic thinking skills. Thanks for listening.